You won't believe the shocking moment that unfolded on national television. What began as a routine late-night interview became one of the most controversial and talked-about events in American media history. Before we dive into the full story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because once you hear what happened when Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat across from Stephen Colbert, you're going to have something to say. Now, let's get into it. It was February 2025, a cold winter evening in New York City. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was gearing up for what producers considered a diplomatic triumph. For the first time since taking power in Burkina Faso, Africa's youngest revolutionary leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was visiting the United States. His rise had already made headlines across Africa, celebrated by young Pan-Africanists as a symbol of resistance and condemned by some Western governments as dangerously radical. CBS executives saw an opportunity. By bringing Traoré to the Colbert stage, they believed they could present him to millions of American viewers as more than just a fiery military leader. They wanted to showcase him as a thoughtful head of state, a man with ideas, not just defiance. It was meant to be a moment of bridge building, a late-night spectacle where politics met personality. The producers worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Colbert's team combed through Traoré's speeches, his history, even the details of the 2022 coup that had vaulted him to power. They knew their host, sharp, witty, and experienced at handling polarizing figures, could balance charm with diplomacy. This wasn't going to be a comedy skit. This was meant to be cultural diplomacy live on American television. The audience filed into the studio that night with no clue of the storm about to break. They expected Colbert's usual blend of satire and smart conversation. They expected to laugh, to be entertained, and perhaps to learn a little about a faraway country called Burkina Faso. What they didn't expect was that within an hour, they would witness a clash of civilizations unfold before their very eyes. As the cameras prepared to roll, Colbert stepped onto the stage, his trademark smile lighting up the room. The audience erupted in applause. Traoré, dressed in a sharp suit, not his military uniform, took his seat across from the host. For a moment, everything seemed calm, professional, and even promising. But history has a way of surprising us. What started as a carefully scripted encounter would soon spiral into a raw, unscripted confrontation that not even the sharpest host in America could contain. And the question that set it all off would be one word, one name, asked with good intentions, but received as a declaration of war. The lights dimmed, the cameras rolled, and the studio audience leaned forward with anticipation. Stephen Colbert, master of the late-night stage, adjusted his papers, offered a wide smile, and began with his signature opening line, equal parts humor, wit, and charm. The show had begun, and for the first 20 minutes, it seemed like everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Colbert broke the ice the way only he could. "Burkina Faso? Did I get it right this time?" he quipped, exaggerating his struggle with pronunciation. The audience chuckled, and even Traoré allowed himself a small smile. It was a human moment, a reminder that, despite the heavy titles and political baggage, they were still just two men sitting across from each other on a stage. Traoré, dressed not in his military fatigues, but in a tailored dark suit, leaned forward with calm confidence. His English, accented but fluent, carried a rhythm that immediately captivated the room. When Colbert asked about the challenges of leading a young democracy, Traoré did not shy away. Instead, he spoke with eloquence about sovereignty, the need for Africa to define its own future, and the importance of breaking free from the economic chains of dependency. The audience, initially cautious, found themselves nodding along. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard an African leader articulate such ideas unfiltered on American television. His words painted a picture of a continent no longer begging for aid or validation, but demanding respect and equality. Colbert, sensing the audience's engagement, slipped comfortably into the role of guide. He sprinkled in humor at just the right moments, joking about how difficult it must be to govern a nation while the host himself couldn't even organize his sock drawer. The laughter broke any tension that might have existed, and for a moment, it seemed as though diplomacy and comedy were working hand in hand. Behind the cameras, CBS executives exchanged relieved glances. The gamble was paying off. They had worried Traoré might come across as cold, militant, or combative. Instead, he was winning hearts with his composure, intelligence, and sharp critiques framed in measured tones. He spoke of Africa's youth, of economic independence, of the need for nations to stand tall without relying on former colonizers. Every sentence carried weight. Every gesture seemed intentional. The conversation flowed smoothly. They touched on France's lingering influence in West Africa, the fight against terrorism, and the hope of building a new Pan-African identity. Colbert, known for his quick wit, matched Traoré's seriousness with balanced questions that kept the exchange lively without feeling confrontational. The audience clapped at several points, particularly when Traoré said, "Africa does not need pity, it needs partnership." It was the kind of statement that transcended borders, and even in an American studio, the truth of it resonated. For Colbert, this was the sweet spot, serious enough to matter, light enough to entertain. He leaned into his strengths, offering playful quips in between substantive questions. "So if I come visit Burkina Faso, do I get diplomatic immunity when I tell bad jokes?" The audience laughed, and Traoré responded with a polite smile, "You may need more than immunity, Mr. Colbert." The banter worked. It showed that despite cultural and political differences, the two men could connect as human beings. For the producers in the control room, it was television gold. For the audience at home, it was shaping up to be a rare window into the mind of a young leader poised to reshape his continent's destiny. But there was something brewing beneath the surface, something no one in the studio could see. The tension had not yet revealed itself, but it was there, waiting. Colbert, emboldened by how smoothly the interview was going, decided it was time to pivot. In his years as host, he had learned that audiences craved more than politics. They wanted personality, humanity, vulnerability. And so, as he flipped through his notes and glanced toward the next segment, he prepared to ask a question that had become something of a signature for him. It was a question he had asked countless times before, a question rooted in his own Catholic upbringing, a question he believed would allow viewers to see the man behind the uniform. But what Colbert could not know, what no one in the studio could have anticipated, was that this question would ignite a storm. It would turn a diplomatic showcase into a televised confrontation. It would push one of America's most seasoned hosts to the edge of silence. For now, though, everything seemed perfect. Traoré sat calmly, speaking of Pan-Africanism with eloquence. The audience leaned forward, captivated by his words. The control room buzzed with optimism. And yet history was waiting just a few minutes away. One question, one word, Jesus, would undo it all. The air in the studio was warm, filled with the low hum of stage lights and the quiet anticipation of an audience leaning into every word. For nearly half an hour, everything had gone flawlessly. The jokes landed, the conversation flowed, and Ibrahim Traoré had emerged not as a militant outsider, but as a confident statesman with vision. The control room was already celebrating. This was the kind of international moment CBS could replay for weeks. And then Stephen Colbert looked down at his notes. He tilted his head slightly, a trademark expression his viewers knew well, the one that signaled a more personal turn in the conversation. What came next would shatter the illusion of control. "Captain Traoré," Colbert began, his voice smooth, measured, and even friendly. "I'm curious about something a little more personal. You lead a nation where Islam and Christianity both play such large roles. As someone tasked with uniting diverse communities, do you believe in Jesus as king? For a split second, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just pause a show, but seems to stretch into eternity. The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. Traoré didn't immediately answer. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on Colbert's, his expression changing from the calm diplomacy of the past 20 minutes to something sharper, something heavier. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, a reckoning. Finally, Traoré leaned forward, and when he spoke, his tone carried none of the warmth that had filled his earlier remarks. "Mr. Colbert," he said, slowly, his French accent tracing every syllable, "I find it very interesting that you ask me if Jesus is king." The audience grew quiet. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room, as if they collectively sensed the shift but couldn't yet define it. Colbert, maintaining his signature smile, tried to lighten the tension with a small chuckle. "Well, yes, I suppose it is a little unusual. But here in America, we often talk about faith as a way to connect. It's just a question of belief." But Traoré did not laugh. His voice grew stronger. "Belief," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Belief is not so simple when it comes to Africa. Because the Jesus you speak of, this king you ask about, he did not come to my people as a savior. He came as a conqueror. He came with ships, with guns, with chains." The audience shifted again, their unease now palpable. You could hear the creak of seats, the faint clearing of throats. Some smiled nervously, unsure whether this was still part of the show or something else entirely. Colbert blinked, his polished confidence slipping just slightly. He adjusted his tie, tried to maintain composure. I meant only to ask about your personal faith," he interjected gently, almost pleadingly. But Traoré pressed forward. "You want to know what I think of Jesus?" His voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, in the sharpness of conviction. "The Jesus my ancestors were forced to kneel before was not a king. He was a weapon, a tool of colonial power designed to make us bow while they stole our land, our gold, and our dignity." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some sat frozen, others glanced toward the exits, as if wondering if it was time to leave. In the control room, the producer's hands hovered over the switch, debating whether to cut to commercial. Colbert, caught off guard, tried again to steady the ground. Captain, perhaps we are misunderstanding each other. I didn't mean to—" But Traoré cut him off. His words were deliberate, sharp as a blade. "No, Mr. Colbert. The misunderstanding was when my people believed the missionaries who said they came with love. The misunderstanding was thinking the cross carried by slave traders was ever about liberation. Tell me, how can a religion that blessed our enslavement, that told us suffering was holy, that told us poverty was virtue, how can that Jesus be king?" The words hung in the air like smoke after a cannon blast. Stephen Colbert shifted in his chair, his rehearsed calm suddenly fragile. The audience sat in frozen silence, unsure whether to clap, laugh, or leave. Cameras kept rolling, operators glancing nervously at the director for instructions that never came. And then Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his voice gathering momentum, his expression no longer diplomatic, but defiant, his tone no longer measured, but thunderous. "You ask me if Jesus is king," he said, his voice cutting across the stage like steel. "I will tell you who was king. Mansa Musa was king. The pharaohs of Kush were kings. The rulers of Timbuktu and Great Zimbabwe were kings. But do your schools teach you about them? No. Instead, we are told to bow before a religion forced on us at gunpoint, told to worship a God that came in the same ships that carried away our ancestors in chains." A murmur rippled to the crowd. Some members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared wide-eyed, realizing this was no longer television entertainment, but a reckoning live on stage.
Colbert raised a hand, trying to cut in with a nervous laugh. Captain, I think maybe we're getting a little off. But Traoré's voice rose over him, unwavering. Off track? No, Mr. Colbert. This is the track. This is the truth you don't want to hear. Christianity was not a gift to Africa. It was a weapon of mental colonization. It taught us to turn the other cheek while we were whipped. It taught us that poverty was blessed while our resources were stolen. It told us that heaven was the reward for obedience while our people lived in chains on earth. The audience gasped. Some clasped their hands, others whispered urgently to their neighbors. One woman in the front row shook her head, whispering, "Oh my God," under her breath. Colbert, visibly flushed now, tried once more to steer the conversation. "Captain, I think maybe we're getting a little—" But Traoré cut him off with a sharp look that silenced even the host. "You wanted to humanize me, didn't you? To let America see that the young African general is just like them. But I am not here to make you comfortable. I am here to speak truth." The misunderstanding, he thundered, his voice now echoing in the rafters of the studio, was thinking that a religion brought by slave traders could ever be about love and liberation. The control room was in chaos. Producers shouted into headsets, arguing whether to cut to commercial. Security personnel began moving quietly toward the stage, unsure how or when to intervene. But Traoré wasn't done. He turned away from Colbert and looked directly into the main camera, his gaze piercing through the lens as though he were speaking not to the studio, but to the world beyond. "America," he said, his voice steady, almost solemn now. "Your Jesus may be king in your churches, but in Africa, we are remembering our own kings, our own gods, our own ancestors. We do not need salvation from the descendants of our oppressors. We do not need to be saved by a religion that justified our enslavement. What we need is to decolonize our minds, to reject these foreign gods, and to remember who we were before you told us who we should be." The studio erupted into chaos. Some audience members clapped hesitantly, others stormed out in visible discomfort, while others sat frozen, stunned by the audacity of what they were hearing. Colbert's face had drained of color. His usual arsenal of humor and quick wit had deserted him. For perhaps the first time in his career, he was a spectator on his own stage. Traoré wasn't finished. He turned back to Colbert, his words sharp as glass. "You sit here in your comfortable chair asking me about Jesus, while your government supports dictators across Africa who crush their people. You want to talk about kings? Let us talk about how America props up tyrants who serve your corporations while silencing leaders who fight for sovereignty. That is the hypocrisy your question hides." The control room made the call, cut the interview. Commercials began queuing, but on stage, the spectacle could not be contained. Security moved closer, their presence subtle but undeniable. Colbert, clinging to composure, tried one last desperate attempt. "Captain, perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. This is a show about dialogue and understanding." Traoré laughed, bitter and sharp. "Dialogue? Understanding? No, Mr. Colbert, this is about power. And tonight, the truth has walked into your studio." His voice dropped, calm now, but with the chilling resonance of finality. "We do not need your approval. Africa does not need your salvation. What we need is for you to stop pretending your gods, your values, your systems are universal truths. They are not. They are chains, and we are breaking them." By now the audience was divided, some sitting in stunned silence, others slipping toward the exits. The stage crew froze, caught between fear and awe. Colbert sat rigid, his famous smirk gone, his silence louder than any words he might have spoken. And as security closed in, Ibrahim Traoré sat tall, unflinching, a revolutionary voice echoing in the most unlikely of places, a late-night comedy stage in Manhattan. The storm had arrived. The show was over.
The stage fell into chaos. Producers shouted in headsets, camera operators froze in disbelief, and security moved with careful precision. The decision had been made. End the interview, cut the feed, and protect the network. But history had already been written. The moment couldn't be erased. Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's fiery revolutionary leader, had walked off the Late Show set with his head high, leaving Stephen Colbert speechless, the audience divided, and security executives scrambling for damage control. Within minutes, the segment was pulled from the lineup. Instead of the interview, viewers at home were greeted by a pre-recorded comedy sketch, a harmless filler meant to cover the hole left by the implosion. But inside the studio, no one was laughing. Colbert sat slumped at his desk, staring blankly into his mug, shaken in a way few had ever seen him. Crew members whispered among themselves, some calling it the most shocking moment in late-night television history. In his dressing room afterward, Colbert reportedly sat in silence for nearly an hour, replaying the exchange in his mind. Friends and producers said he was genuinely disturbed, not just by Traoré's fiery words, but by the realization that he had been completely unprepared for them. The master of wit had met a man who refused to play the game. CBS executives rushed into emergency meetings that lasted deep into the night. The network worried about diplomatic backlash, about the perception of bias, about whether they had just ignited an international controversy live from their own studio floor. Their official statement was cautious, claiming the segment had been misrepresented and taken out of context, but the damage was done. Because despite CBS's attempts to bury the story, the truth couldn't be contained. Within 48 hours, leaked audio of the interview spread across social media like wildfire. On Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, Traoré's words became viral soundbites. Clips of him declaring, "Africa does not need salvation from its oppressors," circulated endlessly, shared by millions across the globe. To some, it was a scandal. To others, it was a rallying cry. In Africa, the reaction was electric. Young Pan-Africanists hailed Traoré's speech as bold, fearless, and unapologetic. Memes flooded the internet, posters appeared in cities across Burkina Faso and beyond, and his words were chanted at rallies, "We do not need to be saved." What the network had tried to suppress became a movement. In the United States, however, the response was sharply divided. Many Americans, especially devout Christians, were outraged. Headlines blasted him as anti-Christian, disrespectful, and even dangerous. Conservative commentators accused him of insulting Western values on American soil, while others defended his right to speak openly about colonial history and its scars. But for many in the African diaspora, particularly African Americans, his words struck a deep, resonant chord. His call to remember that you are descendants of kings and queens, not slaves, became a viral mantra, sparking debates, sermons, and even classroom discussions. For them, it wasn't blasphemy, it was liberation. Diplomatic circles buzzed with unease. Analysts described it as a case study in cultural miscommunication, a simple question about personal belief that had unlocked centuries of pain and defiance. Universities dissected the moment in lectures. Political think tanks cited it as proof of the growing rift between Africa's rising leaders and the West. And for Colbert, the incident marked one of the hardest moments of his career. Known for handling controversy with wit, he had been left utterly speechless. In later interviews with other world leaders, his questions grew noticeably softer, his producers inserting stricter guidelines to avoid another Colbert-Traoré incident. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the fallout only strengthened his image. He returned to Africa greeted as a hero, his speech replayed in schools, rallies, and radio stations. He had not simply survived a clash with one of America's sharpest minds, he had turned it into a declaration of sovereignty heard around the world. 6 months later, the event was still discussed. Historians called it a watershed moment in media history. Commentators said it was proof that late-night television was never built to handle voices that rejected Western frames of reference. And young Africans? They called it something else. They called it victory. The Colbert interview that was never aired became a symbol of cultural defiance, of unfiltered truth, of the refusal to bow. It was more than a television mishap. It was a mirror, reflecting the deep divides that remained between Africa and the West. And it remains, to this day, the most controversial unaired segment in late-night television history. And so the question lingers. Was it a diplomatic disaster, or was it the moment Africa's new generation finally found its voice on the world stage? Perhaps it was both. But one thing is certain. What was meant to be a polite exchange turned into a turning point, and the echoes of that night are still being felt across continents. And that's the story of how Ibrahim Traoré was kicked off Colbert's show after his reply about Jesus on live TV. If you found this story as shocking and eye-opening as we did, make sure you hit the like button, share this video with others who need to hear it, and drop your comments below. Do you think Traoré went too far, or was he simply telling the truth? And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more explosive stories like this one. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just make headlines, it changes history.